Hello, everybody. Good day to you all, wherever you're around the globe. We're really happy to start another season of the International Macro History online seminar series. We have a full schedule running this fall until December. And we will begin today with the first seminar of the season. Just before we introduce our speaker, Greg Clark, let me remind you of the housekeeping rules. So the seminar goes for an hour, 40 minutes of uninterrupted presentation by the presenter, then 20 minutes of Q&A, and then we have an additional 15 minutes informal for additional Q&A session. Please put your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat. We'll be monitoring the Q&A button, so it's on the bottom of your screen. And without further ado, let me introduce Professor Greg Clark from UC Davis, who's going to talk to us about the lack or social mobility or the lack of in England for the last 3.5 centuries. So Greg, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let's see. You can see the screen, I presume?
Yeah, we can see everything. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so this talk is about a book that's in preparation. Let me just check. Hold on. Why is that not going down? There we go. For Whom the Bell Curve Tolls: Culture and Genetics in the History of Human Society. And the background here is that social scientists typically assume that social outcomes are a combination of genetics, educational investments, family, social connections, but with genetics playing only a modest role. And in line with that, we spend an enormous share now of the income of modern societies in terms of education and childcare. And in the US, at least, there are calls for even further investments in this line. But the thesis of the book is going to be quite radical. It's going to say that two facts underpin English social life over the years since at least 1670. The first one is a biological fact that social outcomes are mainly determined by two factors: additive genetic inheritance and randomness. And social interventions seem to actually have very little effect in terms of determining the outcomes. But the second one is actually a very powerful and interesting social fact, and that is that marital assortment in England throughout this period seems to have been very, very strong and correctly measured. The correlation on people's phenotypes, their outcomes, in marriage seems to be in the order of 0.8. And this is actually what is leading to a strong genetic correlation in terms of marriage. And it turns out that that genetic correlation is crucial in determining the overall rates of social mobility, but also in determining the distribution of abilities within society and even the hereditability of social position. And so this is really about an interplay between biological forces and then powerful social forces, because there's nothing that says that marital assortment should be on people's social capabilities as opposed to just based on age or appearance or class background. And kind of this idea that somehow social interventions don't matter, we actually can see that in some work that I've done recently with Neil Cummins at LSE, where we look at extensions of compulsory schooling in England in 1947 and 1972, and we look at the people just before and just after those extensions and look at their house value as measured in 1999. And what you actually see is that these substantial extensions of schooling, because people on average were getting about a half year more schooling as a result of this extension, and it's going to the people who would be most likely then to have left school early, it doesn't seem to have any effect on their social outcomes. And so at least, there is data that actually suggests that we have to be careful to wonder about what exactly is the value of additional schooling in terms of people's social outcomes. So in this talk, then, I have to start with a very simple primer on genetic determination. And it's been found recently that most complex traits are actually influenced by a very simple type of genetic control, which is additive genetics. And what is happening is that for a factor like height, there are thousands of locations on the genome that matter and where there are variants across people. And what happens is that your predicted height is just a linear sum of your value at each of these locations on the genome, 1, 0, or 2. And then what the weight is that's assigned to that particular location. And so it turns out that that's actually a very good predictor now of features like height. And we also know for educational potential, years of education, that you have a similar genetic predictor. And modeling this type of genetic inheritance is quite simple. We will have a phenotype Y and a genotype X, and then there's going to be a random component linking those two, and that is coming from just substantially from measurement error, from social luck in terms of people's outcomes. And then there's even molecular luck, because even identical twins who have the same genome have different phenotypes. And the genome is a blueprint to build the person, but in the actual process of building, things can go wrong. And so you actually have this kind of molecular level luck in terms of outcomes. And then if the father's genotype value is XF and the mother's XW, that of the child is just going to be the average of the parents plus some random component. And there's randomness about which alleles you inherit from each parent, and there's often an uneven split in allele inheritance across parents. And the hereditability, H squared, of any trait is just the amount of the variance that is coming from in the phenotype that is coming from the variation in the genotype. And that's going to be between 0 and 1. For some features inherited by additive genetics, such as the 10-finger ridge count on your hands, H squared is 0.99. For adult longevity, H squared is only about the order of 0.1. There's a huge randomness to how long people live. And so H squared can vary across different traits and just represents the randomness that links the genotype with the resulting phenotype. And then we have to bring in assortative mating. And so we assume that people match based on their phenotype, and that correlation in phenotypes will be R. And that will produce a correlation on genotypes M, but that correlation M will be less than R, and the amount that's less than R depends on H squared. And so there's a very simple link then between phenotype underlying genotype assortment. But it turns out that, as I say, M is going to be this crucial parameter in determining intergenerational social mobility rates, and also in determining the long run intergenerational correlation of status, because it's going to be 1 plus M over 2. With no assortment in marriage, it's going to be a half. With complete assortment, it would be 1. And then in 1918, famously, Fisher published a paper that showed what the correlation would be across any possible set of relatives in terms of their outcomes as a function of assortment in marriage. And what you actually see is that that correlation depends actually only on 2 parameters. There's H squared. H squared always appears, and it always appears in the same effect. And then there's effectively 1 plus R over 2 and 1 plus M over 2. But remember, M is just dependent on R and H squared. So there's really only 2 parameters that matter here, H squared, and then 1 plus R over 2. And what's happening then is that as you move down the family tree, and particularly if we look at collateral relatives such as cousins, what will happen is that there it's just going to be a function of the genetic distance between people, what their implied correlation will be. And we can picture this if we put the log of the correlation of outcomes on the vertical axis, and then the genetic distance on the horizontal axis. You will see this pattern where the descending relatives all fall along a line here, where the slope of that line is 1 plus m over 2. And again, the kind of relatives that involve a collateral element fall along another line, where again, the slope is just 1 plus m over 2. And then there's an implication that the parent correlation will actually, parent-child correlation will actually be higher than or equal to the sibling correlation. And then we can portray this where we plot it with a fraction of the shared genotype, though then we have to make an assumption about what's M and R going to be. And when we do that, as I say, you'll see this kind of linear pattern that basically your correlation is just a function of how much of the genotype do you share with various relatives. And you'll get this linear pattern. And as I say, the slope of those lines are going to be determined by 1 plus m over 2. And so as I say, we've got this one crucial parameter, m, which is what people's genetic correlation, and that is actually going to determine the variance of underlying social abilities in a society, the long-run persistence of status in families, and even how genetically heritable social status is. And here, it just shows you what the population distribution of genotypes will be if you switch from m equals 0 to m equals 0.6, and that's the red line there. And so, as I say, it's not going to affect the average level of abilities in the society, but it will affect the distribution. And as I say, h squared is also going to be a rising function of m. So as the population m switches, say, from 0 to 0.6, what will actually happen is that the hereditability of traits will actually go up within the population. And so what the book is going to do is going to kind of test this simple, almost simplistic model of social outcomes against alternatives. And here we actually run into a difficulty that there are actually very few well-specified alternatives. And it's actually very hard to come up with, well, what is the model that people have for social outcomes in alternatives? Now, for economics, the standard reference would be Becker and Tomes. And that essentially says that the outcome is going to be a function of some kind of inheritance of characteristics, which in part will be genetic, plus the amount of investment the parents make in the child. That model predicts a correlation of income between parent and child, but essentially nothing beyond that, because the model, for example, assumes a dynastic arrangement where each parent only has one child, there's a single parent, and so it's actually a very simplistic model with very few predictions. Other than that, there will be a correlation of income between parent and child. And so it's really hard to test this model against kind of an economics model, though we'll see that when we come to it, there are various interventions we can look at and see what's the effects of these interventions. And then if you go to wider to kind of sociology, we have the idea that culture, resources, social networks are all going to matter. And I think one characteristic of such explanations will be that sibling correlation should exceed those of the parent-child pair. And just to give an example of that, in my own family, I grew up as one of 4 children. Our treatment, our environment was essentially identical. I mean, the parents had the same expectations of us. And so we lived in a very shared cultural and social environment. In contrast, both of my parents were from families of 10 children, and were both 9th out of those 10 children. One family had some problems within the marriage, and there was a lot of kind of disruption. In the other family, my grandmother was a charming woman, but had absolutely no interest in children. And as far as I know, my father might as well have been raised by wolves. So they came from this very different background. And then my grandfather on my father's side did not believe that education was of any value. And so you would expect then that the correlation between myself and my siblings should exceed the correlation in various social outcomes between myself and my parents, given that they didn't have a shared kind of family environment. And given regression to the mean that we observe always in social outcomes, it has to be that the environment actually will differ between parent and child systematically. And so it should result in a feature where the sibling correlation is significantly greater than the parent-child correlation. And so we could actually specify, say, an alternative cultural transmission model where the outcome Y is a function of some family culture plus some randomness. And then what has to happen is that that family culture, as it gets transmitted across generations, has to show some regression to the mean. Or else what will happen is that the varieties socially will just explode over time. And so there has to be some kind of regression process in a cultural model. And B then will be the underlying long-run correlation in status across generations. And that'll be the equivalent of 1 plus m over 2 in the genetic model. But the crucial thing is that in this cultural model, the sibling correlation will exceed the parent-child correlation because the sibling correlation will just be the variance in Z divided by the variance in outcomes. Whereas with the parent-child correlation, there's also this variable B, the regression to the mean. And so I can show you just there'll be a pattern of predictions in the cultural model, which will look very similar to the genetic model, but with this crucial feature that now the collateral relatives, siblings, uncles, cousins, should show a greater correlation than the linear descendant relatives. And so you can see that then, that this is the one crucial difference we would see between these two different models. And so the book then is going to look at tests of the additive genetic model. And the first one, I can't talk about all of them today, so I'm just going to pick out a few of them. But these tests include what's the pattern of correlation to the family tree, how do parent-child correlations look like compared to sibling correlations, is there gender symmetry? One of the crucial elements in the genetic model would be that mothers should matter as much to fathers in terms of outcomes of children. And even in a world where mothers don't have formal occupations or formal education, you should see this symmetry in terms of the determination of outcomes. And we can test that. And that's an interesting test of genetic transmission. There should be a constancy of underlying social mobility rates across generations. Family size or birth order should have no effect. Living versus dead relatives should play no effect. And again, we can test that. And social interventions, again, should have no effect on rates of social mobility. And to test this model, I've been constructing with Neil Cummins now for 7 or 8 years a database, which is a lineage of more than 4,000 people in England from 1670 to 2021 that mainly uses public sources. And we can actually track people across 7 to 10 generations. We do this partly by crowdsourcing. There are many people who have constructed family trees, and we're able to piggyback on those, check them to make sure they're actually correct. But then there's one very nice source is there's an entire society in England, the Guild of One Name Studies, which is devoted to tracking the history of particular, typically rare surnames. And that has the advantage that they track everyone with the surname. And so when we constructed this database, it's constructed around rare surnames, and it's tracking everyone we can find with those surnames so that there aren't any issues of selectivity in terms of the construction of the data. And a sample of the database looks like this. It's quite rich. And then for social outcomes, we have, for people currently alive, we know a lot of people what their address is from the electoral register. That lets us know their house value, the social characteristics of the small neighborhood that they're living in, and we also know if they're a director of a public company. And then historically, for everyone who died in England, we have their wealth at death, we have their adult occupation from the census and the population register of 1939. And then for earlier people, if they got professional qualifications, we typically have lists of those who have those qualifications, and including, for example, we have a complete record of everyone who went to Oxford or Cambridge, which were the only universities in Britain before the 1830s. And in the database here, you'll see, if we just look at all of the people, we have amazing numbers now of second, third, and fourth cousins. We have 1.5 million fourth cousins in the database. And these are people who are genetically very far apart. And so we would expect, if there's very little assortment in marriage, that they essentially would have zero correlation in terms of outcomes if it's being driven by genetics. They would have almost no correlation in their genotype. And then we split up the database into people who fall in general lineages, who have on average status. And then we initially were constructing the database around elite lineages. And these were people who had high status in the early 19th century. And when we were looking at social mobility, it's helpful to have people who give a very strong signal of what mobility rates are. And then a second database that we've been busy constructing in the last couple of months is one where we look at English marriage certificates from 1837 to 2021. And they, ever since 1837, contain the occupations at marriage of the groom, the bride, and both fathers. And they also give, for earlier years, the literacy, by the signature literacy of the groom and the bride. Bride occupations are largely missing before the 1960s, but we can actually get around this and actually measure what assortment is in marriage. And this is what the marriage certificate looks like. As I say, it's been essentially unchanged since 1837. And it also includes the age of the spouses and their condition at point of marriage. Were they married before? How did that marriage end? And again, there's a site constructed by amateur genealogists, FreeReg, which contains more than 1.6 million transcripts of these marriage registers, 1837 to 2021. Neil Cummins, my co-author, has collected all of those transcripts. And from these, we can actually estimate underlying marital assortment in Britain all the way back to 1837. So what we find is, in terms of genetic transmission, is that the Fisher equations fit well across quite distant relatives all across the period 1670 to 2020. And they show the same underlying intergenerational correlation of about 0.8 for different traits. And this is implying that there's a genetic assortment at the point of marriage of 0.6, which is high. And just to give an example of this, so this is the log of people's house value, but normed by region. So it's not influenced by regional differences in house prices, and because people are quite persistent in terms of regional location. And this shows, for this group of people, these are people from average lineages. We can go back to as far as third cousins. So we're looking at people in 1999, and these are the numbers of people that we have. And the birth year of the common ancestor for the third cousins was 1829 on average. And so we're looking at people who are connected by a common ancestor, actually very far in the past. And the first thing you see in this table is that all of these people have correlated house values, and that correlation is statistically strongly significant, even for third cousins. And so these are people who have had no social interaction, typically second cousins or third cousins, and yet they show this very strong persistence in terms of their economic status. And then if we plot this persistence, It looks very much like the picture I showed you earlier. The implied slope of that line is 0.8. The implied value of genetic marital correlation is 0.62, and the R squared is something like 0.95. And then again, if we translate that into a picture where we just have the fraction of the shared genotype and then the correlation and house values, again, as I say, we see this very nice linearity. That dotted line was just fitted to the data, and you can see fitting it to the data, it runs through the origin. Again, the R squared is very high, and it's showing exactly the pattern that you would expect with additive genetic transmission. And one thing is that if we think that, say, genetic marital assortment was much lower in recent years, then we would get the upper curve shown on this figure, where third cousins would be surprisingly strongly correlated. But what we actually observe, as I say, is the lower curve, which implies that the rates of assortment in marriage have been unchanged throughout 180 years in terms of the data. And then we can do this again, but now looking at occupational status. And now we can go all the way to fourth cousins whose common ancestor was born in 1668 on average. And what you see again then is statistically very significant correlations. And it doesn't show up, there wasn't room in this figure, but it's statistically significant all the way down here. And again, if we plot them, there's a little more noise in the data here, but essentially it's the same pattern for people born 1800 to 1859, that genetic distance is a linear predictor of occupational status correlations with the same slope and the same implied rates of marital assortment. And in fact, if we take a whole bunch of different characteristics which have different hereditability for people, so one would be longevity, occupational status, educational status, what we see is that the underlying persistence rate is effectively constant across all of these traits with different rates of hereditability. What else can we do with the additive genetic model? As I say, there's a whole list of tests that we can do here. Here's what parent-child correlations look like compared to sibling correlations. And so the father-child, and that's the 45-degree line that's plotted there. And here what you see is that it actually looks almost more like equality, but there is this pattern that a very strong predictor of the sibling correlation is what the parent-child correlation is in this case. And we definitely don't see a kind of higher sibling correlations on any outcomes than we see father-child correlations. And so it seems to reject the idea that there really is kind of strong contemporaneous cultural influence. I mentioned gender symmetry. Before 1920, women had few occupational opportunities. Middle-class women typically had no formal occupations at the time of marriage. How much did women versus men matter to child outcomes? We can measure that in the genealogy by looking at grandchild outcomes as a function simultaneously of the paternal grandfather's outcome and the maternal grandfather. And what you see is that for wealth, paternal grandfathers matter about 3 times as much as maternal grandfathers. They both matter, but the paternal influence is much stronger in terms of wealth. But if you switch now to occupational status or higher education, what you find is that there's no statistical difference in the predictive power of the paternal grandfather versus the maternal grandfather. And so even though only men had occupations in this society, women end up playing as important a role in determining these outcomes as do men. Is mating assortative to the correct degree? This seemed implausible in the sense when we first looked at this, because the phenotype assortment in years of education between people is only in the order of 0.4 to 0.5. And so to get this underlying genotype correlation of 0.6, then you need a phenotype correlation, which would be in the order of 0.6 or 0.8 or 0.9. And so that seemed to, something mysterious seemed to be happening here. But recent whole genome studies in Britain, looking at the genomic predictor of years of educational attainment, actually find that the genotype correlation across partners is 0.65. And so it's actually amazingly consistent with the data. And with these people, the phenotype correlation is only something like 0.4. And so the question is, how can the genotype correlation be higher than the phenotype correlation? And so we think this is just an issue of measurement. And so what we can do is, in the marriage registers, we have this quadruple: the groom, the bride, the father-in-law. And what we think is that for the underlying phenotype, the perfectly correctly observed phenotype, there's going to be a correlation of R between groom and bride, and a correlation of B between the father and the groom and the father-in-law and the unrevealed social phenotype of the bride. And that should then lead to the groom and the father-in-law. If the marriage is between the groom and the bride, then the correlation between the groom and the father-in-law should be RB, and the correlation between the father and the father-in-law, RB squared. Now, this is the underlying correlations if we could observe perfectly. In practice, we have very imperfect measures of all of these things. And so that creates a measurement error for everything that we observe theta. And that means that it's very hard to measure social mobility rates across time and across societies because those measurement errors actually differ. It's also very hard to measure marital assortment, again, because we do have these measurement errors. However, if you look at the structure of the diagram here, in this case, R, the phenotype correlation, the true phenotype correlation, will actually be the correlation of the father-in-law to the groom divided by the correlation of the father to the groom. Go back to the diagram here, you can see it's going to be theta RB divided by theta B. And so we can infer R from these underlying correlations. And similarly, the intergenerational correlation B is going to be theta RB squared, the father to father-in-law correlation, divided by the father to groom correlation, theta RB. And so what we could do then with the marriage records is try and get kind of measurement independent estimates of what the phenotype correlation is at marriage and what the intergenerational correlation is in terms of the phenotype. And we have, in the early years, enormous amounts of data with which to do this. Because of the interest of the people collecting these records, we have much less data for current years. But in progress, I have someone going to the Essex Record Office archives, and he has already collected, I think, about 8,000 more observations for the 1980 to 2020 period. And so we think in the end, we'll actually have plenty of data from this period as well, where we can actually do this estimate. And so then if you look at the father-son correlation, you can see that over time on these status measures, it's actually been going down quite significantly over time, somehow implying potentially that there was greater social mobility rates. But as I say, always with this issue of measurement, when we do the division of the father-in-law son divided by the father-son to get R, what we actually find is that that number is roughly 0.8 until we get to the current period. But at that point, the standard error blows up. The standard error is going to be high here because you're taking a ratio of things. But we've got such an amount of data that we can measure R within, 0.02 is the standard error for the earlier periods. And you can see that it's high and very stable over time. And then again, when we estimate B, we find that this is in the order of 0.9. And again, it's high and stable, except in the last period. But it's not statistically different, the estimates in the last period, because of this problem of the quantity of data that we're actually observing. So how do we reconcile this? We find in the genealogy that marital implied genetic correlation is 0.6, and the long run intergenerational correlation of status is 0.8. We find in the marriage data that the assortment in marriage is 0.8 for the phenotype, and the long run, and not the long run, the current kind of correlation in the phenotype, implied correlation across father to son or father to daughter, is 0.9. These things fit together if the heritability of social status is high at 0.75. And it's arguing here that the reason genetic assortment is so close is because phenotype assortment is even closer. The phenotype the social science investigator observed is just a very imperfect signal of the phenotype that marital partners observe. When we use measures like years of education or highest occupation or occupational status, stuff like that, we're getting a very imperfect estimate of the social capabilities of the parties involved in the marriage, and they're actually matching on much better information, and the evidence seems to be that they're choosing to match at these very high rates. So let me end with some speculations then. There's an enduring puzzle, the long delay in the onset of the Industrial Revolution and its location in Northwest Europe. One intriguing possibility is that for social or cultural reasons, Europeans developed a pattern of very high rates of assortment in marriage that was associated then with a widening of the distribution of abilities within society. And that process, if they switch the pattern, would actually take hundreds of years to fully go through. And what's interesting about European marriage is that it typically involved women at much later ages getting married to men, and also that the parents played much less role in marital arrangements. And so it could be that, interestingly, intriguingly, that culturally, somehow the development of very high-level educational abilities in European societies was actually linked to some point of adoption of such a marriage pattern. And the second feature of such an explanation is that differences in class fertility would actually have an effect on both the level and distribution of abilities within society. One group that we can actually measure their fertility for very well is people who are graduates of Oxford or Cambridge. We can measure that all the way up to people who were born in the 1960s. And we can compare that to England as a whole. And what you actually see is that in the pre-industrial period, these people had higher net fertility, and we can estimate that just by taking all recorded children that they had that survived to age 21, or just sons, because often daughters are omitted in earlier genealogies. And then what you actually see is quite a dramatic collapse of their fertility in the late 19th century, but also, according to these estimates, quite low levels of fertility now. And so this would have some potential implications if we take 100 people and look at their descendants, if they all were Oxford graduates or were just average people in England over this time, what you would see is a very big rise in the period of the Industrial Revolution in terms of the stock of this kind of elite group. And then, since then, a very significant decline in their stock relative to the rest of the population. So these are purely speculative elements at the end of the discussion, but it says that there is this kind of implication of this data that potentially these social patterns could combine with kind of biological transmission to actually lead to changes in the distribution of abilities across society, and also changes in the average level of abilities. Though I would think that the changes in the distribution would actually have many more social consequences than the change in average levels of abilities. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Greg, for a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation, and thank you for keeping to the time. So we will open now the Q&A session, and let me take my moderator's privilege and ask you a few questions up front, and then we'll get the other people in the queue. Just in beforehand, I will If you have no, I mean, for the people in the QA, I will try to unmute you, and you can raise your question in person rather than me reading your question. So be prepared for that. Okay, so while you're preparing for that, let me ask Greg, I guess 3 questions. I have many, but I'll limit it to 3. One of them is one to the model, one to the data, and one to the whatever the external validity or the conclusions. So in terms of the model, I think that, and you in the paper itself, you do some kind of a model tweaking with a cultural institutional model. But one of the main ingredients is the fact that you assume regression to the mean in the culture. And this is something that, especially in the marriage market you're so heavily discussing, may not be the case over the last few decades, in the sense we see a lot of variety. Heterogeneity is actually increasing in terms of, first of all, marriages, then divorces, then single parents, and then same-sex partners, etc. So this thing doesn't seem to converge. And this is the market you're particularly interested in. So that's kind of a modeling thing. And once you change that B in the cultural model, and it's closer to 1, then it could replicate the genetic one. I think one of the, in terms of the comparisons between the models, where the other one, the genetic one does have a regression to the mean, and this one won't, then this could compensate for that.
Let me answer that, and then I'll let you ask the next question. Okay. So I would like to have a better model to test this against, right? To test the genetic model against, but there isn't much out there, and so there are some things though that if you don't have regression to the mean in terms of culture between generations, and so that if people perfectly learn the culture of their parents, then you won't reproduce another very important feature of the data, which is that between parent and child, there's a lot of flux. But as you go further down the family tree, there's an implied kind of stability, right? And so the correlation between parent and grandchild is much closer than you would expect from the parent-child correlation. The correlation between parent and great-great-grandchild is again much closer. And so the world is operating as though there's some hidden thing that's being inherited and then some noise above that. And the trouble is, if you switch to perfect inheritance of culture, you lose that crucial feature, right? And so anyone who's going to produce a cultural model, and I noticed there are 90 participants here. I think it's a fantastic challenge to people to say, given the characteristics of this data, can you produce a model of cultural transmission which will actually do that? But I'd say it's actually quite hard to find a model that'll produce those same features.
Okay, so that, I mean, I think it's a challenge, but I think it's a worthy challenge, as you probably suggest. A couple things about the data. So to what extent focusing, at least in the long-term data, on the rare families, rare name family trees, etc., represents some kind of a self-selection bias or some selection bias in terms of rarity or inclusion, something that's more isolationist, etc. And maybe related to that, have you tried to do some placebo tests where sort of, at least for the more distant relations, like the third cousins, where you get a correlation coefficient of say 15%, you try and match these people with some random people in the British census and see with some Monte Carlo and stuff like that, see how significant is the difference between a random correlation with a distant people on the tree and the contemporary average, somebody drawn
right.
from the.
That's another good question. And so on the placebo test, I did do a random assignment of people as relatives, and the correlation drops to 0. Right. And so if we take the actual people born in roughly the same periods and then just randomly assign them to each other, then you do get a correlation of 0. And then the nice thing is we can actually test the status of our people against the national level data for things like wealth and then for occupational status. And what I can report is that they're a bit above average, the people that we're finding, but not dramatically so, right? And I think we can deal with some of that maybe just by reweighting, right? But because we have so Neil, my co-author, has national data on wealth distribution all the way back to 1858. And so we can test against that and see how are we doing over time. And we could also test against other features. And so, as I say, it seems that it's relatively representative of the population as a whole. Maybe it's a little bit high. And I think that there's a reason for that, which is that people are only going to construct these genealogies if they have sufficient time and income and education. And so there will be always the problem of somewhat positive selection of people who actually construct such a genealogy.
Oh, okay, thank you for that. And finally, some external validity policy takeaways. So I think you mentioned it, I think in your last, in your conclusion, it's not that emphasized in the paper and in the introduction, is that to what extent the enormous investment in social policies is more about the average, increasing average productivities, and obviously you can see the difference. And so even for that, you need a lot of investment as opposed to redistribution or increasing mobility. So and I think that most European countries or most advanced economies invest a lot in they have a uniform emphasis on investing quite a lot in the average quality, social qualities, education, health, etc. And then the redistributional policies differ between countries. So the Scandinavians would probably at one extent, the Anglo-Saxons or England would be at the other extent. And you're looking at England, which has a relatively low preference for redistribution in terms of tax policy, et cetera, compared to other Europeans. But so I would not so dismiss, because you started out with saying all this social investment, it doesn't counteract the genes. It doesn't counteract them maybe in the distributional sense for countries who don't do a lot of redistribution, but it does matter for the average. So we want to be precise about the takeaway for policymakers with that.
Yeah, now we have in the data some estimates of what happens to families. So for example, we have one family where there's 30 children, right? And we have a bunch of families where there's one child. And what I can tell you is family size has a very modest effect. It does have an effect, a statistically significant effect of family size, but it's tiny, right? And so that actually says, look, all these care and attention that parents are pouring into children, there's not a lot of evidence that quantity of that care and attention is really playing that big a role, right? And then, as I say, with this other paper with Neil, we have looked at these schooling interventions, because one of the things we find that's amazing in this data is the constancy of all of these things across the years from 1670 till now. And yet, over that time, we've gone from 0% public investment in education and training to 10%. And one of the things you would think that would do is it would benefit the bottom part of the distribution much more than the upper part of the distribution, who would privately get these goods anyway. And yet we're not seeing any kind of changes in the underlying rates of social mobility. And so I think there is a lot of the data that in some sense says that we maybe need to kind of re-examine how big our investments are in some of these things like education, because we are always assuming that this is crucial both for average outcomes, but also for social mobility. I mean, there's a strong belief that social mobility is very heavily dependent on public investment in education.
Yeah, I think this is something again for when I have other people ask questions, but sure. I think this is something again for a different paper, looking at say you take the 10% of investment in education, how much of it is actually allocated to raising incomes per capita in general, health, et cetera, and how much is it directed to reducing inequalities within a relatively affluent society like England compared, say, to low-income countries, so that have no equivalent investment. So in that sense, but that would be for a further study to see the effectiveness, and I'm pretty sure that out of the 10%, probably 8 or something is about the average, and maybe the 1% or the redistribution is the smaller part, but we'll leave that for additional research. So let me begin by the order of the queue here that I saw initially. So Gabriel, I'm unmuting you, and you can ask your question.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, Gabriel.
Yes, we hear you.
Oh, thank you so much. So it's just a super basic, straightforward question about endogeneity, right? You presented the initial model, you showed genes affecting a phenotype, and it looked like all of your derivations of R and M and heritability and things like that depend on genes not being correlated with environments. And I mean, obviously that can't be true, right? I mean, the people who live in my household must be genetically more similar to me than to you. And if that were not true, it'd be super scandalous. And of course, you know, your parents' phenotype is kind of your environment, right? If your parents are matching on wealth, then you grow up wealthy. So, I mean, what does it imply for all of your derivations that, you know, they seem to be done under the assumption of exogeneity, but that assumption can't be true, right?
Yes, what is stunning about this data is that it depends on this idea that there isn't going to be, this correlation doesn't matter, okay? But that's something we can test in the data because we see various environmental innovations and exogenous changes, right? So we see things like what happens if your parent dies when you're young? Does that have any effect on your life outcomes? And the answer in the data is no, it doesn't matter, right? And that's actually been found in other studies that early death doesn't matter. We can actually test that. And also there are adoption studies, twin studies, which again actually show surprisingly modest impacts of shared environments on people's outcomes, right? But it's a very good question, right? I mean, it's a crucial question, right? Because and also another thing that's raised then is, look, myopia is presumably genetic in terms of its tendency, but I'm wearing glasses here to correct that. And so it may be that we're observing in these families genetic transmission, but a society could come and intervene and change all of the outcomes because the outcomes are also very susceptible to environmental influence. And all I'm saying is, though, in the data, we can look for that. And the amazing thing is that we can find in these lineages almost no impact of these environmental shocks.
Okay.
But, so sorry, so for instance, your estimate then of say M or R, right? I mean, the true value must be some different number because it presumably includes both genetic and environmental components. So for instance, you find very high numbers, no?
Yeah, no, what I'm saying is the data, what the data seems to be saying is that it's mostly actually flowing through your genetic inheritance, right? That at conception, most of your life outcomes have actually been determined, right? And that whatever path you end up taking then, it doesn't depend on having that social connection with the parent to end up with that correlation with the parent, right? And all I'm saying is I haven't got time to go through the various tests that we can do. We can look at family size, we can look at birth order, all of the things that you think would show environmental influences actually suggest very modest environmental influences. Now, this is because, in part, you're living in a society where if you become an orphan, then the state takes you to an orphanage and then they rear you in the orphanage, right? In other contexts, that might not be the case. But at least in the social structure of Britain in the last 300 years, actually having that social connection with your parent, there's not a lot of evidence that that is actually making a significant contribution to your outcome, aside from your biological connection with the parent.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move to Chris Colvin. So I'm muting you.
Hi, Chris.
Hi, Greg. Just a very quick question about orphans. I'm wondering whether you have them in your data set and whether you can use that as a nice clean test of your alternative transmission mechanisms. I have many more questions, but I'll just keep
well, we do have people who become orphans because we have everyone who has that name. And in Britain, adoption was very uncommon. And so even when people became orphans, they would typically retain the name that they were born with. And so we do track them, but we haven't, we often don't know who they end up living with as a child. And so we haven't attempted to do anything systematic. But let me refer you to some of the work of my student, Matt Curtis, who is in Brussels now in a postdoc. But he has done a nice study for his dissertation using an extensive genealogy in Quebec. And one of the features in the Quebec data is that often children end up having a second mother because the first mother dies in childbirth and then the father remarries. And we know the educational status of both of those mothers. And interestingly, the outcomes for children in those blended families depend on who your mother was, your biological mother was. They don't depend on who actually rears you, right? And so the mothers actually make a contribution. The child is more likely to be literate if the child had a literate mother, independent of who actually raised the child in the family. And so that kind of speaks kind of to the orphan issue. And so that's what's nice about his data is he's actually able to look at well, and also he's able to show in marriage if sisters exist such that one is literate and one is not literate, the literate sister marries a higher status husband, right? And so even within marriage, you can actually see that literacy matters in terms of the matching. Thank you.
We have time for one more question in the ordinary session, then we'll end and we'll switch over to the additional 15 minutes, and I'm sure that the other questions could be heard then. So I'll turn to John Turner. John, are you ready to go online?
Thanks, Nathan. Hi, Greg. Thanks.
Hi, John.
Really interesting paper. So I'm really interested in one of your outcome variables. So it seems to be you've got this data on being a director in 2021. And I'm just wondering, could you say a little bit more about that? Because, there's nearly 5 million directors in the UK in 2021, but are you looking at like directors of important companies, publicly listed companies? And can you think about looking at directors, say in 1950, 1900, which might sort of help verify what
right.
you're finding?
Yeah. So we realized that information was available because there's a directory maintained by the government. And so we haven't tried to kind of split it up. So sometimes it's because someone's a doctor and their surgery somehow is a public company, and then they're listed as a director as well. And it's definitely correlated with their social status. But I have to say that that's actually a much weaker correlation than your house value with other elements of status. But we were using that to make some kind of more comprehensive measure of status. But sorry, go ahead.
It might be worth looking. So back, I think 2010 is the last sort of, there's an annual edition called the Directory of Directors, which is elite directors of large companies. And that was published all the way from 1880 through to 2010. So it might be worth looking at that list.
Right. I was a little bit disappointed that I thought there would be more information on that. And the nice thing is, using the rare names, it was very easy information to gather, right? Because you can just say, how many people called Basil Jetta are on this directory, and then as opposed to looking for Smith or Jones or something like that. But so it is an interesting piece of information. And I haven't thought about adding it kind of systematically in earlier years. I mean, the locational information is quite powerful in terms of predicting people's status, and so that's a nice feature. But that's it's you have to then collect the address, match that up to the property value, and so that's a much bigger task.
Yeah. Thanks, Greg.
Thank you. Sure. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Greg. So we reached the 1 hour mark for the formal duration of the seminar. So let me thank you now for your provoking presentation. And we had a very lively Q&A, and we have some more questions online here for the next 15 minutes. And just to remind people that we meet next week, we're going to have a presentation by Kristen Wunschneider, Chris Mitchner, and Kevin O'Rourke on the Smoot-Hawley tariff trade wars. And so those that want to leave we reached the formal end. And for those who want to stay, we'll go in an additional 15 minutes. And we'll start that right now. And I see Tobias Korn on the list here, but I think he might have left. So we'll leave that question for later. So let's check the, so Christy Swampole, I'm bringing you online.
Hi, Christy.
Good evening. So, Greg, I just wondered, how did you determine the 40-year periods that you used? Is that considered a generation, and how robust is this over time?
Oh, this was for the marriage data. That was just purely arbitrary. We were just dividing up the data into kind of convenient chunks that wouldn't have too many lines on the table. And so, with that data, we'd be happy to try it in other kind of units. By the way, I should say on this marriage data that we just gave a presentation to a group of sociologists. And it turns out that the way they like to measure social status is just by looking at how do occupations correlate in terms of father-son or father-in-law-son measures. And so with that marriage data, we were actually able to recreate some of these social status measures. And I must say they work amazingly well, right? They're incredibly powerful predictors and produce significantly higher correlations. And so it really is kind of nice to see that and that, I think, as I say, is because of this very strong inheritance that's going on. But it's really nice that you can actually validate that the sociologist's approach to social status and the economist's approach, they're actually getting at something that is correlated at a level of 0.9. I think if you use pure economic measures and then just social association measures of social status.
Thanks.
Thank you. So I see a question from Judy Stevenson. She left. Let's see. Tony Moore, you want to ask? I'm unmuting you. So.
Thank you. Yes, no, fascinating paper. I put kind of a wall of text up there just for future consideration, but maybe the bit I'll focus on is that kind of third question at the bottom. So I'm just wondering whether, in terms of this assortive mating, are you kind of envisaging it as some kind of a market in which everyone is looking to match with a high potential phenotype, even if they themselves are a low potential phenotype? Or is it assortive matching in that someone who maybe suspects that they are not that great would prefer to assort to someone who is also not got that high potential? Or are you trying to sort of trick your way into right, getting with someone who's better than you?
Well, no, I mean, the matching game is that everyone's trying to find the highest ranked partner. I must say, when we first did these estimates, we actually were a bit stunned at how high the implied correlations were, right? It took us a little while to realize, well, that's actually very consistent with this high genetic correlation, because they should be then very high. And as I say, the thing that we find that's very nice is if you look at occupational status correlations between father and son, on our data, it's something like 0.7 if you go to the early 19th century, and now it's down to 0.3. And so you might then think, oh, there's been a lot of increase in kind of social mobility, and maybe, matching in marriage is much less strong. But if you then take these ratios and look at what the implied matching in marriage is, it hasn't gone down and it hasn't gone up. It's actually stayed at this very high level. And so, as I say, and all we can do is guess at what are people doing in terms of this matching. And our guess seems to be that that's the thing that crucially matters to people, that they have some estimate of the social capabilities of their partner, that these estimates are very good in once they go for marriage. And then what we need to do more of is to test that the matching isn't, say, between the groom and the father-in-law, because that would distort the estimate. Right. And so there are other societies where the matching actually wouldn't be between the partners, but we haven't run that yet. I'm busy preparing the data. But what we can actually do is test where we know the age of the bride. And so we would say young brides, it's much more likely that the family had a more significant influence. Or also we have brides who are marrying for a second time, where then you would say, well, the family influence is going to be much less. And so we can actually examine, do these correlations change if we look at the circumstances of the marriage. And then we also know for a lot of the people, it's recorded on the marriage certificate, is the father dead? And so presumably dead fathers should have much less influence on these marriages than live fathers. And so again, we can say, do the correlations change between the groom and the father-in-law in that case? And as I say, the nice thing is we've got so much data on these marriages that we can do that. And there's another test which we can run where we look at the literacy of the bride and groom and see how does that correlate with their father-in-law. And it's symmetrical, right? The strength of the correlation between the bride's literacy and her father-in-law is the same as between the groom's literacy and their father-in-law. And so we actually find kind of lots of evidence that I think is consistent with the idea that European marriages were formed by the parties themselves. And then you get these other kind of interesting implications about the strength of the bonding here. Yeah, but these are all excellent questions. Yeah.
Thanks. So if I may just ask one follow-up, which would be
Sure.
thinking about, you just mentioned about the age of marriage and how it might be a proxy for parental influence. But the other thing it might also be is the later you marry, the more people you've had the opportunity to meet, say, and the more people you can meet, the more chance you have of finding. So the wider your social circle, the more people you're exposed to, the more chance of finding someone who is, a more suitable match.
Yeah, I mean, given the quantity of data, they're really interesting things we could look at, because we do typically, for a bunch of the early ones, they just tell you, was the bride or groom age 21 and above or not, right? But even that is a nice piece of information. And so as I say, we can look, are there patterns to marriage where young people marry for love and old people marry for status, right? And that would be, as I say, an interesting finding that would show up in terms of the correlations with fathers-in-law. So this, I must say, is a fantastic database. I mean, I know how much time it does take to just record the details of one of these marriage certificates. And so the people who contributed their labor to record 1.6 million of these things. I mean, I can't even imagine how many man hours have actually got into that. We looked on their website to see if we could make a donation, and they don't even have a page to allow you to make donations for use of this data. And so, as I say, it is a fantastic news source of data, and with lots of these interesting implications.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll let, it's been waiting, Shmuel Yerushalmi. So I'll see if he's online. He left. David Mitch, I see he's online.
Hey, David.
David.
Yeah, hi. So mine's a simple-minded question. I mean, I know in previous work you've done international comparisons and so on. And recently I came across a PhD student working on the case of India and the caste system. And I was wondering to what extent you've looked at that and comparison with the British case and so on.
Yeah, no, those are interesting questions. Well, here's one interesting observation. There is a part of the world where you marry your first cousin. That's the ideal marriage partner. But typically in that type of marriage, there's not a lot of candidates, right? I mean, there's not a lot of first cousins available. And so it turns out if you were just to marry a random first cousin, and that was the systematic marriage pattern of the society, the genetic correlation you'd have with your partner would be 0.28. It would actually be lower than the genetic correlation that you're observing in terms of these traits with the marriage pattern we're seeing in England. And so as I say, that some kinds of arranged marriages would actually produce lower assortment, right? If you just have to marry whatever dumb cousin happens to be of the right age band for you. In India, I think marital assortment is going to be extremely high because of the nature of the marriage in these cases, because you're selecting within a certain caste still for a lot of people. And then where the parents are involved, then the status of the parties is very important. And you don't even meet the person unless they pass kind of a first screen. I don't know if that will continue, but it is also the case that surname evidence suggests that India has even slower rates of social mobility than somewhere like England, right? And so I think it's potentially quite consistent with this idea that what is really driving social mobility rates is the nature of assortment in marriage, and that you can get societies like India where this assortment is so comprehensive that you've actually eliminated almost all social mobility in the society, at least at the group level, right? That the Brahmins as a whole are converging to the mean at very,
But
very
you've
slow
looked at
rates.
some data, or some data is out there using surnames, whatever, for India. That
Yeah. So what I've done is I've looked at data using surnames for India, and then I have a student who just finished his PhD, who again you're looking at the surname level, looked at these elements, right? Though he, and I can't remember now exactly why, but he actually concludes that it's not marital assortment that is actually driving this. And I have to go back and look and say again exactly why it was, because he thinks he can sort out people where there's more or less marital assortment, and he doesn't find that that has much impact.
What's the student's name? What's the person's name? Who's...
Oh, I'm going to blank on it if you suddenly ask me like this. David, I'll send you an email with the details and put you in touch with him. I think you'd be interested in his work. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, David. So we have time for one more question. So Gary, you want to go online?
So great. One question, big question I have is just I'm wondering about you didn't talk much about the selectivity of these unique surnames. And I'm wondering, and there's sort of an assumption that they're either randomly assigned or that they're assigned in the way that are equivalent to other people. But could the rare surnames like be assigned to people that have maybe very strong genetic traits or very particular occupational backgrounds or family backgrounds? So their assortment is not the same as the general population. So they're not represented.
Right. Yeah, so it's a legitimate question. You know, how do you end up with a rare surname in Britain, right?
Yeah.
And so there are multiple ways. One way is because of immigration over time. And so some of these rare surnames were the surnames of, say, Huguenots who came in to England,
Yeah.
right? And now that actually means that you'll have a start in the 1680s of a relatively elite group. But over the course of 300 years, that group should revert to the average, right? And so that's one source. A second source is because very low status people would misspell a standard surname, and that would somehow then get embodied in the records, right? And so there's a bunch of people who have a rare surname because their ancestor couldn't spell, and somehow it was never corrected, and that misspelling of the name is actually still in the record. And then another feature just is that some parts of England, for cultural reasons, because of different long histories, so Cornwall produces a lot of relatively rare surnames. And it's just because of the history of a separate Cornish language, and then identified with particular surnames, right? And so you will find that just local kind of cultural variations will actually produce these kind of relatively unusual surnames, and then immigrants coming from other places, and then randomness as well, right? And it's just, you know, all rare surnames are eventually going to become extinct. And even relatively common surnames will head towards rareness as that process happens. And so then you're just observing the randomness of births over time and how many daughters you had versus sons, stuff like that. And so, as I say, all we can do is then check what do we have against the records of kind of national, kind of what's fertility levels in our surnames, what status at various times in the surnames. And, you know, there's always going to be this issue about, is it fully representative? For the marriage records, no. The marriage records are completely random selection of records. People typically record everyone who gets married in a certain parish, and it seems to be a relatively random set of parishes across England. And so that's not a problem. But I agree. I mean, all we can do is just check the data, right? Because you don't want genealogical records where someone just says, oh, this is my family history, because there people tend to cut out relatives who they're no longer interested in, right? And that kind of trimming is very bad. And then you only get the line going back if there's a succession of sons that go back in this particular lineage. And so it's well known that a standard set of genealogical records are problematic in terms of inferring things like fertility, but also for social mobility, right? Because of their
Yeah.
selectivity of construction. So that's why we wanted the rare name ones where people say, I'm committed to incorporating anyone who has this name into my surname collection, into my genealogy here.
Okay, so we reached the end of our time, and there are a few more questions on the Q&A that for people that left. So you'll get them. We'll email you the rest of the questions, the ones that we didn't
Sounds
get
good.
to discuss. And again, I'd like to thank you for participating in the seminar, giving us a provocative talk. We had a lively Q&A, and see you all next time.
Thank you very much. That was great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day. Bye, Greg.
Thank you, Greg.
Bye.
Thanks.